In our past issues, we have repeatedly mentioned other species of people who lived on Earth at different times. Some of them are our distant ancestors. Others turned out to be dead-end branches of evolution. All of them, except our species, are now extinct. But sometimes the evolution of mankind took quite bizarre forms. Today we will tell you more about the most unusual species of prehistoric humans. Subscribe to our channel. This will allow you to be the first to know about the release of new videos on the evolution of life on the planet. With the help of your likes and comments, these videos can be viewed by the maximum number of science lovers. Also, the activity of viewers will allow the creators of the channel to assess the interests of the audience. Homo habilis. Until recently, Homo habilis, or skillful man, was considered the first hominid to be able to make primitive tools. It is also likely that it was the habilis who were the first humans to switch to omnivory. Our earlier ancestors favored a vegetarian way of eating. Skilled man was first described in 1964. He inhabited the territory of Kenya, South Africa, and Tanzania in the period from 2.5 to 1.5 million years ago. According to a number of external features, habilis were very similar to gracile, that is, less massive Australopithecines. But also in their structure there are features characteristic of later hominids. Their skulls had a more rounded vault and larger brain cavity than all known Australopithecus species. Their brain volume is estimated to be about 1.5 pounds. They also lacked the occipital ridges that Australopithecus had. The face of skilled man is no longer so flattened. The nasal cavity is pushed forward, and the grins, on the other hand, are moved backward. The jaws are smaller than those of Australopithecus. The teeth of Homo habilis are smaller than those of its ancestors, but larger than those of its descendants. This clearly illustrates the tendency for their size to gradually decrease in the course of hominid evolution. With more graceful body sizes, the proportions of habilis limbs were the same as those of Australopithecus. Their feet were practically flat, without a pronounced arch. The toes were short, and the big toe was completely brought to the rest. The man of skill was no more than 4 feet tall and weighed about 121 pounds. It is from the habilis that the beginning of the rapid growth of the brain size of our ancestors can be traced. They were the first to use stone tools, for which they got their name. Skill man is the creator of the early pebble culture. It is also referred to as the Alduvi or Aldevan culture. The first finds of the remains of this primitive man were made in the year 1960 in a place called Alduvi in Tanzania. The habilis made the simplest stone knives. They probably used fire and knew how to make primitive clothing. These ancient people ate mainly nuts, other fruits, and roots. Small animals were also part of their diet. Rudolf man. Around the same time as skilled man, another species of historical humans lived in East Africa. Its remains have been found in Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. Their age ranges from 2 to 2.5 million years. Scientists have not yet determined the degree of its kinship to modern humans. It could be both our distant ancestor and a side branch of the evolution of the genus Homo. The first discovery associated with this extinct species of people, made in the vicinity of Lake Rudolph in Kenya. It consisted of a single incomplete skull. It was described by the Soviet anthropologist Valery Pavlovich Alexeyev in 1968. He also proposed the first name of the new species, name of Hyatacanthroprodolsky. Later studies still allowed to attribute these creatures to the genus Homo, so it was assigned its current name. Outwardly, Rudolf man did not differ much from Homo habilis. They were ape-like creatures with flattened faces, sloping foreheads, and large jaws. The back of their head was massive and protruded backwards. Current estimates put the brain volume of these ancient humans at up to 700 cubic centimeters. This is considerably larger than the Australopithecines that preceded it. They could have been over 6 feet tall. These were upright creatures that lived in savannas, semi-deserts, and along the shores of water bodies. About the way of life of Rudolfsky man can only be guessed. At the moment, there are not many fossil remains at the disposal of scientists. It is believed that they lived by hunting and gathering. It is unlikely that they could make any serious tools or weapons. Most likely, for his needs, the Rudolf man used improvised objects like rocks and sticks. Hominolidi. In the year 2013, the scientific community was shaken by a truly unique discovery. Two speleologists managed to penetrate the remote Dinaladi Grotto of Rising Star Cave, near Johannesburg. On the floor of a cave measuring 1 by 9 meters, almost undisturbed by time, lay the remains of 15 individuals of a previously unknown species of primitive humans. After the discovery was studied by professional anthropologists, the species was given the name solitary man, or Homo naledi. Among the skeletons found were the remains of both adults, teenagers, and children. Due to the remoteness of the chamber from the cave entrance and the difficulty of entering the cave, no one had been able to find this burial site before. It is believed that the way to this remote grotto was also difficult during the time of the Homo naledi. Therefore, some researchers have suggested that they herded their deceased tribesmen there. This behavior may indicate the presence of rudimentary funeral rites. It used to be thought that this feature on the culture of later people. Also, some scientists have suggested that the dark traces on the ceiling of the cave are remnants of soot from torches. That is, the inhabitants of the cave could light their way to a remote chamber, and near one of the skeletons a piece of stone was found, which may have traces of processing. But the exact answer to these riddles scientists do not have yet, and dark spots on the ceiling, and depressions in the floor of the cave, and a single object that looks like a tool may have a natural origin. Heidelberg man, strange as it may seem, this very interesting from an evolutionary point of view species of man has not greatly interested scientists for a long time. The first discoveries related to the Heidelberg man happened in the middle of the 19th century. At that time, quite a lot was already known about both Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons. But about the intermediate link between primitive erectus and sufficiently developed later sapiens, scientists had not yet given much thought. Meanwhile, the Heidelbergensis, who lived in Africa, Europe, and Asia between 800 and 130,000 years ago, had many interesting traits and skills. In terms of brain size, they came very close to modern humans. They were the first to build some semblance of complete dwellings, to produce sufficiently high-quality and functional tools. But their main achievement was the domestication of fire. If there are no traces of fires at the sites of primitive people 400,000 years old, then already 350,000 years ago they are in many caves and open areas. All these achievements allowed mankind to begin settling in the territory with the Terpurkorn. It is believed that they're part of the Heidelberg people who moved to Europe and came the ancestors of the Mer du Blas. And this happened about 300,000 years ago. There is also an opinion that our immediate ancestors descended from those left in Africa about 100 or 200,000 years ago. But it is possible that the branches of the development of man of reason and Heidelberg man diverged even earlier. The populations on different continents were isolated from each other for a long time. This explains such significant differences in the structure of their descendants. Externally, Heidelbergensis or pre-Paleoanthropes were much like Neanderthals. More precisely, these Paleoanthropes retained the features of their ancestors. They had skulls with thick walls, pronounced brow arches, massive oblique chins, and low foreheads. The dental arch had already acquired its modern shape by that time. The average height of the men was even taller than the Neanderthals. It was about 5.5 feet. Women were slightly shorter. There is evidence that representatives of the African branch grew even up to 2 meters. They lived in small family groups of several dozen individuals. They obtained food by gathering and hunting. Most likely, several clans periodically organized periodic hunts for horses, elephants, bison, and other large ungulates. In their way of life, they differed little from all other tribes of hunter-gatherers, including modern primitive peoples. In addition to the presence of man-made dwellings and skills in communicating with fire, other qualities were characteristic of the Heidelberg people. There are archaeological findings that confirm the care for the weaker and infirm members of family groups. Also, the structure of their brains suggests the possible presence of primitive speech. There are also signs of primitive burial rites. Found tools up to 500,000 years old are not only functional, but also beautiful in their own way. Among the finds are ochre and other simple dyes. All this means that these ancient people were quite socialized and had an understanding of art. Javanthropus. Also, these ancient people from the island of Java are called Ngandong or Saloan man. The first finds of their fossilized remains were made near the village of Ngandong on the banks of the Solo River. There, in the early 30s of the last century, the remains of 12 individuals of different ages were discovered. 8 adults of different sexes, 1 male child, and 3 skeletons of indeterminate age and sex. An accurate estimate of the age of these remains is not yet available. Different methods of investigation give a range from 143 to 546,000 years. The structure of the skulls of Giganthropes is close to those of Pentacanthropes and Synanthropes. They have an oval shape with a sloping forehead and a protruding occipital part. The brain volume of adults averages 1,100 cubic centimeters. Scientists have been able to accurately estimate the height of only one female. It was 5 feet. She weighed about 110 pounds. The males were obviously a little larger. Presumably their habitat was open forested areas. They lived in the neighborhood of animals such as elephants, topiary, tigers, and river buffalo. There are finds in the form of rudimentary stone and wooden detachments. This suggests the possibility of creating primitive tools. Like many ancient people, the Giganthropes were hunters and gatherers. There are also suggestions that cannibalism was widespread among them. The group found on the banks of the Solo River most likely perished in a volcanic eruption. As a species, they began to disappear about 125,000 years ago due to the spread of tropical forests. Modern science suggests that the Giganthropes could not have been the ancestors of the natives. At this point, they are considered a dead-end branch of evolution. The repopulation of this region by humans occurred about 40,000 years ago. Man of Flores. This species is discovered relatively recently and still hides quite a lot of mysteries. In 2003 years, in one of the caves on the island of Flores in Indonesia were found fossilized remains of several unusual people. Their average height was about 1 meter. For this they received the unofficial nickname hobbits. The first analyses showed that their age ranged from 12 to 74,000 years. Scientists assumed that hobbits were the last neighbors of our species. But later studies have shown that the Flores man became extinct, not earlier than 60,000 years ago. Also near the bones of people were found tools, the age of which is estimated between 500 and 200,000 years. Despite a brain volume of about 400 cubic centimeters, these primitive people could be quite advanced and intelligent. The body structure of hobbits was quite bizarre. They possessed short legs, and their hands and wrists had rather primitive devices. At the same time, the thumbs were arranged almost like those of modern humans. The skull of the Floresian man was low and flattened, with a protruding facial part and pronounced brow arches. It was an isolated island population. Hobbits neighbored Komodo varanas, large carnivorous birds and other predators, many of which outnumbered them in size. Therefore, the main food of the Floresian people was various plants. They could also hunt small animals and birds. At the same time, they used primitive tools and knew fire. The biggest mystery for scientists is the origin of hobbits from Flores. According to one version, they are the descendants of the Asian branch of the straight man. According to another, hobbits came directly from African people. Also, some scientists are of the opinion that the inhabitants of Flores is the descendants of the first representatives of sapiens, who began expansion to the Pacific Islands earlier than the rest of the tribesmen. Dwarfism is a common feature of many different isolated populations. The main version of scientists sounds like this. Whoever were the ancestors of these dwarfs, he decreased in size after getting to the island. But in this version does not fit the discovery made in 2017 year. There were also found the remains of an even smaller man of a similar creature. By all indications, it lived there before all the hobbits discovered before that. The age of the remains is estimated at about 700,000 years. This means that the ancestors of the Flores man came to the island directly from Africa. It was unrealistic to travel that distance by sea at the time. The only plausible explanation so far sounds like this. The ancestors of hobbits were brought by some natural disaster like a giant tsunami, but this version at the moment is not confirmed by anything. Maybe later will be found remains of an intermediate species between the Flores man and man skillful. Then scientists will have a more coherent version of the origin of this species, Denisov man. Denisova Cave in the Altai has a very convenient location and configuration. It is not surprising that for thousands of years it served as a shelter for the most different kinds of ancient people. During the excavations, which began in 1977 year, in different time layers found the remains of our ancestors and Neanderthals. But in 2008 year, the cave gave researchers a real surprise. By that time, in science actively used technology to obtain DNA from fossils. The genetic codes of Neanderthals and ancient sapiens had already been obtained and deciphered. But it turned out that the DNA of the owners of one tooth and phalanx of a finger from the Dennis cave belonged to a completely new species. Also to him attributed 2 more teeth, discovered in 1984th year. According to such a small number of finds, it is difficult to judge the appearance and way of life of the Denisof man. It is safe to say that they were dark-skinned, black-haired, and brown-eyed. But now it is no longer a secret that Cro-Magnons, Neanderthals, and Denisovans could have a common offspring. In the genes of the modern population of the Earth, there are traces of DNA of all 3 species, but the descendants of sapiens and Neanderthals are mainly distributed in Europe and the Middle East. And traces of DNA Denisovci found more in the inhabitants of the South Pacific region up to Australia. There is also data that Denisov man could crossbreed with some 4th kind of people, which is still unknown to science. There is an opinion that ancestors of Denisovs left Africa separately from ancestors of modern sapiens and settled Asia and islands of Pacific Ocean, reaching the territory of modern Indonesia. They could move north, along the course of the Yangtze River, which is how they ended up in the vicinity of that very cave. This is the only human species to date that has been described solely on DNA analysis. Therefore, many scientists are still cautious about distinguishing Denisovci in a separate species of people. Even the official Latin name has not been assigned to them so far. We thank you for watching this issue. If you are interested in the history of evolution of different species that inhabited the Earth, then pay attention to our previous issues. We also talk about ecological and human problems in them.